to have joining us a distinguished speaker who will spend time talking about New Zealand, the Pacific, the Asia-Pacific, and our favorite topic in Washington, the United States of America, and how we should be thinking about the region. Winston Peters was appointed the Minister of Foreign Affairs after the 2017 general election in New Zealand. It's what we call in Gulf a mulligan. He was Foreign Minister previously in previous government from the 2005 through 2008 timeframe. Winston Peters has a long background in politics, of course. He first was elected in 1978, and in 1993 he formed a party which is a core member of the current coalition and the previous coalition, called the New Zealand First Party. It seems to me there's a trademark violation there, but we can see about that. He is going to speak to us here on the podium, and then I will take the opportunity to ask one or two questions and then open it up to this very experienced and distinguished audience. Mr. Peters is also, of course, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for State-Owned Enterprises and Minister for Racing. He was a former New Zealand Maori rugby representative, but because of time constraints, we will not have a haka. We are extremely pleased to have back in Washington again Minister Peters. Please. Thank you.
Good afternoon. And as for a trademark violation, when you're first with the idea, you're first. That's how the Patent Office works, and that's how it works for the idea of calling yourself first. Anyway, welcome to ambassadors and representatives from embassies in Washington, D.C., including Ambassador Rosemary Banks and the New Zealand Embassy, as well as U.S. government officials, and greetings also to members of civil society, a most marvellous term when you talk about civil society. I'd hate to see uncivil society, but never mind. Academia and the business community, and a particular thanks to Mike Green from the Centre for Strategic and International Studies for hosting this event. And a very, very special thanks to US Ambassador Scott Brown, who's here, and his wife, Gail, who's not, but for their tireless efforts to seriously advance the relationship between the United States and New Zealand. We come to Washington, ladies and gentlemen, on a dual purpose. On Thursday, our delegation will be attending the Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, and as a country that is a strong supporter of freedom of religion or belief, and of the right of freedom of opinion and expression, New Zealand stands with all countries who share this foundation stone of freedom itself. In New Zealand, we've also witnessed the debasement of these ideals when a stranger to our country unleashed his cowardly violence on innocent members of Christchurch's Muslim community, peacefully then honouring their religious beliefs. And so we understand in a way previously unimaginable for ordinary New Zealanders to grasp the evil consequences of religious hatred and violence. That tragedy, however, only reinforces our deeply held belief in religious tolerance and freedom. And so we come to Washington to listen and to share our experiences. We are especially admiring of the United States and the contribution two of its founding fathers made to the advancement of religious liberty and democratic freedoms. Thomas Jefferson, who could choose from any number of historical achievements to have chiseled on his tombstone, included instead his authorship of the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom. As President Jefferson elaborated on his commitment to freedom of conscience when he addressed the Danbury Baptist Association, saying, and I quote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So if politics and religion are two subjects usually best left to the conscience of each of us, sometimes the creative fusion of both can lead to freedom's march for all of us. A good example was James Madison's study of the early Puritan communities and their eventual fragmentation across the New England landscape. Observing that a competitive balance was achieved among rival Puritan communities, one that prevented any one faction from dominating the others, Madison, in Federalist Paper No. 10, unfurled the brilliant insight that Republican government cast over the extended sphere of an entire continent would similarly achieve a balance of competing voices in the many states to avoid domination by any one particular interest or region over the whole. To avoid by any one domination of particular interest or region over the whole. Religious freedom and pluralism are therefore two pillars of the foundations underpinning both United States and New Zealand-style democracy. One can also add a third and fourth pillar, namely respect for and protection of human rights and promoting and maintaining the rule of law itself. Ladies and gentlemen, together these strong foundations see our countries as two of only 9 that have held continuous democratic elections since 1854. Just 2 of 9 countries can make that claim. There is, of course, a fifth pillar that connects our two democracies. That is, the promotion of free and fair trade, which is our second purpose for coming to Washington on this journey. This objective is an old one for New Zealand, with former Finance Minister Walter Nash meeting President Roosevelt and members of the US State Department and Treasury in 1939. Quotes, with a view of paving the way ultimately for a reciprocal trade treaty, end of quotes. Now, some very good things, as I said back in New Zealand, take time. But as we said in Washington last December, time, tide, and political change wait for no man or woman, and now is the time to act. At last year's 6th US-ASEAN Summit, Vice President Pence conveyed President Trump's offer, and I quote him, to make bilateral trade agreements with any Indo-Pacific nation that wants to be our partner and that will abide by the principles of fair and reciprocal trade. End of quotes. We stand here to say New Zealand is uniquely ready in our fulsome record and attitude to free and fair trade to take up the President's offer. In a December 2018 speech here in Georgetown, we laid out our perspective on the geostrategic rationale for greater US engagement in the Pacific. 6 months on, we reaffirmed the logic of that speech while noting real progress in collaborative efforts among like-minded partners, including New Zealand and the US, to work together to enhance regional security and developmental assistance in the Pacific. For example, last year, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan announced a partnership with Papua New Guinea, which aims to connect 70% of its population to electricity by 2030. This project will deliver serious benefits to the people of PNG, currently having only 13% of the population with reliable access to electricity. A key point made in the Georgetown address was that partners need to support each other economically through free trade and by understanding each other's economic imperatives, because only by doing so can we achieve our collective ambitions to strengthen the economic engines that drive our mutual ambitions to lead, compete better, and ultimately see the Pacific region and each other prosper. While the geostrategic rationale remains as strong as ever, we'd like to focus today on the economic grounds for advancing a bilateral free trade discussion between our two countries. We want to begin by saying to our friends in Washington that the United States' limited engagement in trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific is of real concern to New Zealand. First, however, let's acknowledge that the Indo-Pacific region has benefited significantly from the U.S. presence over the last 70 years. Indeed, the U.S. commitment in our hemisphere has brought strategic stability, which has in turn allowed the region to address many of its internal fault lines. For example, through the establishment of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN. That stable presence has allowed countries to focus on improving the living standards of their people, largely through domestic economic reforms and also through negotiating agreements to reduce and remove barriers to trade and investment. These agreements have been achieved through a range of different vehicles. Bilateral agreements have been one important platform for improving prosperity across the region. Examples include the United States Free Trade Agreement with Australia or New Zealand's Free Trade Agreement with China. Multi-country agreements have also had their place. The ASEAN Free Trade Area is one example of a successful regional trade and economic agreement. The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, a high-quality deal between 11 countries across Asia-Pacific and the Americas, is another. Ladies and gentlemen, agreements such as these have a serious impact on patterns of commerce and investment in the Indo-Pacific. And over the past 2 decades, we've seen a growing number of countries in the region conclude a significant number of trade and economic agreements with each other, all which reduce barriers to trade and investment between them. The upshot is that for those countries which have engaged in this manner, they are able to move goods, services and investment across each other's borders with lower costs and much more business certainty. And the converse is also true. For those countries not participating in these negotiations, they are by definition becoming less competitive relative to those countries who are progressively removing barriers to trade and economic activity. And while we seriously admire the boundless creativity and innovation that comes out of the United States, particularly your truly amazing ICT companies, the reality is that the United States also remains a large producer of more traditional goods and services, much of which is destined for export markets. And this is where we have the real concerns for the United States' future prosperity. While most countries in Asia have been actively negotiating trade agreements between them, with the staggering economic growth of China, one obvious symbol of the greater trade engagement seen across Asia, the U.S. in the last 20 years only negotiated 3 free trade agreements in Asia with Australia, the Republic of Korea, and Singapore. Now, while these are significant countries in the region, they are by no means the biggest economies. In fact, taken together, these 3 countries represent just 12% of Asia's GDP. Now, we point out that the impact of the U.S. post-NAFTA record of concluding trade and economic arrangements and agreements in Asia is having a serious impact on your share of trade in Asia. The trend of U.S. exports to New Zealand is a case in point. Although New Zealand and the U.S. enjoy a strong economic relationship, the reality is that the United States' share of exports to New Zealand has been declining. And this is consistent with the broader trend for U.S. exports to the Asian region. Notwithstanding the fact that U.S. exports to the world have grown by 5.3% on average per year since 1990, the share of United States total exports to New Zealand over the same period dropped from nearly 18% to 10%. During that same time, imports from our regional partners with whom we have a free trade arrangement, have grown in relative importance. By example, China's exports to New Zealand have grown on average by 17% per year, and China's share of total exports to New Zealand has grown from 1% to 20% during that time, becoming our largest source of imported goods. This trend is even more marked for the United States' share of imports across Asia. In 1990, 17.4% of all goods imported to Asia came from the US. By 2018, that 17.4% had fallen to just 7.4%. That means that the US has lost half of its market share over a 28-year period, and gives you a sense of the significant scale of lost opportunities for US exporters and workers. So the question becomes, how has this come about, and what can be done to reverse this decline in US exports to New Zealand and more broadly the Asia-Pacific region? For most economic commentators, the answer is clear. The deteriorating share of US exports has been the result of the growing network of bilateral and regional trade and economic agreements of which the US has not been a part. By example, New Zealand has been at the forefront of negotiating trade agreements across the region. We negotiated an FTA with Singapore in 2001. Thailand followed in 2005. Our first regional FTA with Brunei, Chile and Singapore came into force in 2006, laying the foundation for what ultimately became the CPTPP. In 2008, New Zealand added an FTA with China, and our bilateral trade with China has tripled in just 10 years. Our second regional FTA with ASEAN, which also includes Australia, and a separate bilateral FTA with Malaysia were added in 2010, and further bilateral FTAs in North Asia were made with Hong Kong, Chinese Taipei and Korea in 2011, 13 and 15 respectively. Our most recent FTA, the CPTPP, that's Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, came into being late last year. A new trade and development agreement has also been concluded with the Pacific called PACER Plus, which we are working to bring into force. As a small trade-dependent nation, New Zealand will never rest on its laurels. We have negotiated an upgrade of our original FTA with Singapore. We're working on the upgrade of our China FTA and starting on an upgrade of our agreement with ASEAN. Negotiations are also ongoing for new agreements with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the European Union, the Pacific Alliance, along with the new Digital Economy Partnership Agreement with Chile and Singapore. This is just the trade negotiating activity undertaken by New Zealand. Most other countries in the Asia-Pacific region have embarked on similar programs. Bringing this back to the US context, the eventual CPTPP provided the US with a ready-made platform to reverse the declining share of US exports to the Asia-Pacific region. Although some were disappointed at the decision to withdraw by the US when it was called the TPP, many in New Zealand understand and respect the right of your administration to make this decision. Because until we fix the shortcomings of the TPP and made it the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, many of us in New Zealand back then had similar reservations. President Trump has expressed his preference for negotiating trade agreements bilaterally. As we said to Vice President Pence when we met last December, New Zealand is ready to work with the United States to achieve such a breakthrough in our bilateral trade and economic relationship. Such an agreement would be beneficial to the United States and New Zealand in its own right. More so, it would have strategic and symbolic importance for far greater than the undoubted mutual economic benefits. It would underline the strong friendship between the United States and New Zealand, and signal to our exporters and our investors that our two governments are absolutely committed to further strengthening our bilateral friendship and relationship. More importantly, it would send a signal into the Indo-Pacific that the US is in the region to stay and provide substance to the President's offer for free and fair bilateral trade engagement. It would signal that the US involvement in the region will be broad and comprehensive, with an ambitious economic program to mirror the US strategic and security objectives. And it will signal to other countries in the region that the US is open for business and looking to conclude ambitious, high-quality and comprehensive free trade agreements with other countries in the region. It would also reinforce a noticeable feature of the United States trade history during the past 3 decades. Ladies and gentlemen, whether it's by historical accident or irony, it's a fact that of 16 trade negotiations the US has entered into since 1985, Republican presidents started 12 of them and signed all bar one, making the GOP as the most open to pursuing free and fair trade deals. To conclude, New Zealand believes there exists compelling geopolitical and economic rationales for the United States leadership to shift gears by launching a bilateral trade agreement with New Zealand. Over the past 2 decades, the US-New Zealand relationship has only grown stronger, more dynamic, and more vital. Whether it's on military cooperation and shared service, people-to-people connections, visa access, or high-level dialogue on vital foreign policy issues, our two countries are much closer than we were at the turn of the century. However, one glaring gap remains in an otherwise exemplary bilateral relationship. We have not made the progress on a bilateral trade agreement that we should have, and New Zealand wants that to change. We earnestly hope the US shares that ambition for New Zealand's ability to play its part in promoting our shared values in our part of the world very much depends upon it. Thank you very much.
Join me here on the
Yes.
chairs over here, Mr. Minister.
Yeah, can I just grab my... Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I was remiss in not acknowledging Ambassador Brown before. I can say as one citizen of this republic that I was moved and also very proud of the way he represented our values and interests during the tragedy in Christchurch. Can you hear me okay? Before we continue, there we go. I think I hear the echo of my voice. Let me also say that it's really a mark of how strong U.S.-New Zealand relations are, really a high water mark, that the Foreign Minister of New Zealand can articulate American interests and values in the Asia-Pacific, as well as any member of Congress or the administration, and do so based on real shared interests and values, not just somehow parroting what the U.S. would think. This is from the heart, and it really speaks to exactly what our interests and our values are in the region. Our relationship has had its ups and downs. It's hard to be more intimate as allies and partners as we were when members of the Texas National Guard and the Maori Regiment were clawing their way up Mount Casino, or Marines and Kiwis in the Solomon Islands. And we probably have had very few allies who've taken a hit as hard as our alliance did in the mid-'80s, but we've really come back. And it's a real testament to the foresight of your government and your Foreign Office and ours as well. I was the senior Asia official in the Bush White House for 5 years, and we began that process, but it really took efforts over a decade with multiple administrations on both sides on a bipartisan basis, and it's a really important thing. I wanted to ask one or two questions, then we'll open it to the audience. I was struck by New Zealand's white paper on foreign policy, which, to my mind, echoed very similar thinking in the Australian white paper, the Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, the US free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, really arguing to the New Zealand public and the world what New Zealand has at stake in a free and open, rules-based Asia-Pacific order. And as I said, very much echoing similar white papers and strategic documents coming out of Japan, Australia, the US around the same time. So in many respects, it seems that we are aligned on what's at stake and at least implicitly on the big question mark, which is the future of China. But I suspect there's going to be some strategic discussions and some hard choices in the years to come. And I wanted to ask you where, from New Zealand's perspective, you think our collective relationship with China is going in the region. New Zealand, I'm quite certain, was the first country to negotiate a bilateral FTA with China among the OECD countries. Has sort of been out there in front. Beijing looks at New Zealand as a fairly safe place to test some of these diplomatic and trade ideas before taking on more difficult countries. New Zealand's been in the forefront in many ways. So the first question for you is, given the context of the general alignment of democracies around the Asia-Pacific in terms of what's at stake, where do you think we're heading with China? Where would New Zealand like to see the US-China relationship, New Zealand's relationship with China, or other countries in the Asia-Pacific go in their relations with China?
Well, I can't speak for the US relationship with China. Only this administration and its representatives can do that. But with respect to what we seek with respect to China, we seek to have free and open trade arrangements with them. We seek to have engagement with them in the Pacific, but when we say that, we do specify the kind of rules that underpin our engagement. And our engagement, when we're involved in the Pacific, focuses and prioritizes the interests of the local people, not New Zealand. So much so that to the extent that we don't demand that any contract arising from our aid program should be, first of all, granted to a New Zealand company of interest. That is put on the market internationally competitive so that we can honestly look the recipient in the eye and say, this is money that's coming to you with the greatest sense of neutrality as to its purpose, and it's uncontaminated by our national interest. We want to advance your cause, and that's the reason why this donational grant, as it always is made. Now, that makes us quite unique in the Pacific, dare I say it, because other countries expect their foreign aid connection to be, if it requires service or other contracts, to be offered first to the economy of making the donation in the first place. Now, there's a certain economic nationalism I can understand about that, but I can say that with respect to China, when we talk to them, we make it clear what our level of and our priority and our criteria is, and we hope to work within that. And when we have joint contractual arrangements on aid, that has been our objective, that has been our primary purpose, and that's been the criteria we've laid down, but it has not always, to be honest with you, been successful. And a number of projects have not gone as well as they should have gone.
New Zealand's announced a Pacific reset. Australia's stepping up. The US also has, really in a way I haven't seen in my professional lifetime, focus on the Pacific Islands. There's now a full-time director for the Pacific Islands on the NSC, for example, in the White House, which was never the case in the past. Can you give us some context here in Washington? I mean, the usual framing of this in Washington is, somewhat simplistically, we can't lose the South Pacific to China, but that's certainly not how people in the islands would want to see it, and it's probably not quite a right framing. How do you see the Pacific Islands in terms of geopolitics and development and the way we should be thinking about it?
Well, it's probably reflected in our Pacific Reset, which we announced soon after becoming the government in 2017, where we announced a policy of looking at the Pacific with our eyes wide open and being honest and informed enough to admit what we were looking at and how it had happened. And one of the parts of that admission or reflection of what happened to the Pacific was that we ourselves, dare I say it, alongside Australia and the US and others, had taken our eyes off the area of our nearest neighborhood, namely the Pacific, and that there are consequences for that. And I suppose if you're looking at it from, say you were looking at the Pacific like a house, well, you can be concerned about the kitchen, the floor and everything else, but the first thing you should fix up is the roof. And it was starting to leak and no one was looking at the most fundamental of things. So by using that as an analogy, we've got up and had a good hard look at the roof first of all, and we want to get that fixed up, while we get a whole lot of other things fixed up as well. And doing that, our simple message to other countries, like the United States and the UK or the EU and others who still have interest in the Pacific, is that we can do a whole lot better working collegially together than going about it separately. And we'll get there a whole lot faster. And whilst we're doing it, let's remember some rules of engagement with the Pacific are concerned, because they've been there for thousands of years, and respect is the number one thing they want.
Is the roof that's leaking, are you more worried about hard infrastructure? Is it civil society? Where should we be collectively putting our efforts?
Well, the roof's only an analogy, but there's a whole lot that's gone wrong.
I got to fix my roof at home in Bethesda, so that's why I'm asking. What's the roof? What do we need to work on?
In the Pacific, there's a massive infrastructural deficit. And if we're going to take these countries, when there's already two very good examples of taking countries from the totally undeveloped world into the developed world, and the Cook Islands graduates this year. New Caledonia has already graduated, so there are two. And there are others as well getting close to it. But if we're going to take countries from where they were to where we want them to be in the future, then we're going to have to make some fundamental investments. And the question becomes then, well, why would we bother do that? The answer is, well, have a hard look at who's going to step in unless you do. Who will fill the void and who will fill the vacuum? Now, the great thing is that countries like Indonesia and Japan and others are beginning to have to see with greater clarity what's going on, and they have stretched out and reaching out to us for engagement. We just hope that Washington understands with greater clarity what's going on. For if I can say to you, and it's been a long personal belief, born of a very close study of a person called General Douglas MacArthur and his engagement in the Pacific, that the Euro focus, or everywhere but the Pacific focus or obsession of Washington, still largely remains. And it needs to change, because the biggest economic and military theatre in the world is the Pacific. So we need to look with fresh eyes at it, may I humbly suggest, where the United States is concerned.
Well, for our part here, the Asia program at CSIS is as big as all the rest of the world's programs together, so we're doing our bit.
Yeah.
And polls generally in the US show that for the past 8 or so years, most polls show, not all, that a majority of Americans think the most important region in the future is the Asia Pacific. But the South Pacific, the Pacific Islands, you could count on two fingers the number of experts in Washington on the Pacific Islands. I think you'll see more. Georgetown University, where I teach, has a Center for Australia and New Zealand Studies. We're doing more on the Pacific. And you'll find a lot more partners to dialogue with in Washington.
Well, can I just say,
Yeah,
that's because you've got, when you say that polls here show that local population regard the sort of next great area of influence being the Asia Pacific, I think the Pacific in that context is just an add-on, where I think the Asia partly joins up. I'm talking about this massive, huge blue continent that goes all the way to the west coast of the United States and all the way to the Sea of Japan and our part of the world. It is massive, it is huge, and although it's not heavily populated, strategically it is critically important, as important as any other part of the world.
The people who really know Asia have been arguing that since the 1820s. But it's very far away from most Americans, which is precisely why the partnership with New Zealand is so important for us, for Japan, for others to understand where we can make a difference. I was quite struck by your comments on trade. Correct me if I'm wrong about the history of the New Zealand First Party, but my understanding is it was created in 1993 in part because it followed a decade of quite dramatic liberalization in New Zealand. And here you are as Foreign Minister talking about the importance of trade and of trade agreements. So you obviously think it's important, but you've also made the point it needs to be made right for the people who are represented in these agreements. And I was struck that you picked up on the bilateral FTA framing of the administration, but you still talked about CPTPP. Do you envision the U.S. sort of coming in through these bilaterals eventually to something like CPTPP? I assume if the U.S. just does a series of bilateral free trade agreements in Asia, that would not suffice from your perspective in terms of what would be good for regional stability, U.S. engagement, and economic growth.
Well, I think the thesis of that speech remains, but by the same token, we have to face reality. We've got a president who was talking about bilateral free trade agreements. That's between two countries, his and another country, in the Indo-Pacific, that had the following requirements, all of which New Zealand fits. So that's why I've made that emphasis. If you're going back to 1993 when New Zealand first started, and on the question of free trade, our argument back then was on a lot of these deals that it was not fair trade. That free trade to work has got to be free and fair. And we also followed very closely the campaign leading up to 2016 in the United States, where you started off with all the contenders on both sides, Republican and Democrat, being pro the TPP. They all were, apart from Sanders. And by the time it was all over, and with the intervention of number 17 in a 17-man field, namely Donald Trump, there had been a switch. But the Trans-Pacific Partnership versus the comprehensive and progressive is a significantly different document. And many of us studied the concerns of the United States constituency about their lack of sovereignty, democratically speaking, on this issue. In the same way that we had serious concerns in New Zealand, and New Zealand First, the party I belong to, and dare I say it, a significant little chunk in the Labour Party, who are very influential, shared our concerns. When the election was over, in an electrifyingly fast time in Vietnam, we had a chance to change all this, and you had to be there to see how dramatically the whole dynamics changed. We had a very recalcitrant, difficult Japan at the start, and all of a sudden, a Japan that had changed to providing a serious leadership role at that time. And in the end, we did get the agreement that we think is far different to the previous agreement, one that we believe the US could sign up to today.
I think that is an intriguing and quite compelling narrative, given your own political context and where we may be going in our politics on trade. So I think that's quite important. I hope members of the press will pick up on that piece. I find it quite important. Let me open it up to the audience for questions. Be brief and identify yourself and wait for a microphone right here in the second row.
Hello, my name's Gordon. Winston Peters, as I'm sure you're aware, there was a petition submitted to Parliament a few months ago asking you guys to withdraw from the Foreign Tax Compliance Act treaty. Do you think if that passes, will it have any impact on the future of economic relations between New Zealand and the United States?
We get that question all the time here at CSIS.
The petition went to which Parliament?
New Zealand Parliament. You were there.
Well, I am there, but let me tell you, I don't rush out when I hear that a petition's arrived. They come thick and fast. At this point in time, it's not created any attention in the New Zealand Parliament. And to the best of my knowledge, it's not been heard yet. So when it goes to a committee, the committee that might hear it, then it'll have a profile.
Let me go over here first.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. My name is Jackson Richmond. I'm with Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org. New Zealand has had a contentious relationship with the State of Israel from New Zealand backing UN Security Council Resolution 2334 in December 2016 to recently a Kiwi government website omitting Israel and instead showing Palestine. Is New Zealand interested in pursuing better diplomatic relations with Israel?
Well, the resolution 2334 you mentioned, right? Yes. Well, that was a resolution that in the dying days of the previous administration did not go before Cabinet as it was required to do. Any resolution of that type at the United Nations, which has any aspects of being the enunciatory or critical in that context, must, by our system, go before the full Cabinet of the New Zealand government. It didn't. And so when the new government came in, myself in particular, insisted that the record be put straight. And we did.
Over here, I think we have an economics question.
Yeah, Deborah Elms from the Asian Trade Center in Singapore. I understand why you want a bilateral FTA from the 30,000-foot level. That makes sense. But as soon as you get down into the practical nature of what that agreement contains, it seems to me you run into a ton of problems. Dairy, agriculture, getting it through Congress, et cetera. So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that the Trump administration says to you on Thursday, fantastic, we take you up on your bilateral offer. How long do you think this will take to conclude, to negotiate, to actually see the light of day? Are you planning for a relatively short negotiation, or do you think this is decades in the making?
The honest answer to you is out of focus is getting it started. Because once people start talking, you got a chance maybe you're for completing the discussion and taking it to finality. All of the obstructions and difficulties you might talk about are there in every trade negotiation with all over the world, whether it's with South Korea, who had 200,000 farmers in protest at an APEC meeting I went to years back, or whether it's Brazil, which has a similar attitude where we are concerned, or parts of South America where their agricultural industries are concerned. But the fact is, we believe that as in the big picture, if you took that attitude, you wouldn't have a trade deal with anybody, because there's always going to be some conflicts unless your economies are totally different. And on the question of agricultural trade, in a world that'll need more resources, more food, and more product from land, whether it be beef or meat or some other product, nevertheless, if we're all working together, we're going to better service the market than all competing against each other and driving the price down. So there's a lot of things we can talk about, but our objective is to start the negotiations to recognize some plain facts. The United States has 20 trade deals, free trade deals. In the case of 13 of those trade deals with economies smaller than New Zealand, we're only one of 9 countries with an unbroken line of democracy since 1854. And I can tell you they're pretty unique, those countries. Canada, the UK, United States, and us, Australia, they're the first 5. And it's not too hard to find the rest, but there's not very many of them. There's got to be some reward for being a good country. Or what? Well, what are we talking about when we're talking about shared values? Do you mean people who really share them, who put their heart and soul behind them, or ones that find it convenient until they go around the next door neighborhood and in some other part of the world and start behaving differently? I think good nations should be rewarded and bad nations be punished. Not the reverse is what I'm saying. Some of the bad ones are getting all the rewards and the good ones are being ignored. You wouldn't do it as a mother and father. You shouldn't do it as an international body either.
That's a great note to end on. The minister has a tight schedule. He's got a full set of meetings with the administration on the Hill. And that's terrific because what we've heard today is a really important message, heartfelt, based on democratic values shared since at least 1854, and interests in the Pacific and especially the South Pacific that really align with ours. So, Minister,
well, just one thing.
Yeah, please.
We gave women the vote in 1893 before any other country contemplated it.
Yeah. My daughter.
I just want to finish off by saying this. Our number one judicial officer, the head of the Supreme Court's a woman, as was the previous one. Our highest constitutional position is a woman, the Governor-General of New Zealand. Our highest political position is a woman, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And the highest bureaucrat in terms of the civil service is the head of Treasury. She's also a woman. So we've got some values worth imitating, in my view, that you might like to proselytize this part of the world. Thank you.
And you're a very capable ambassador. Thank you.